Billionaire Ottavio Montserrat never imagined that a lonely walk on the beach would change his life forever, until he discovered an abandoned baby in the sand. As secrets unravel and unexpected bonds form, his world shifts in ways he never expected. But is fate offering him a second chance or a dangerous challenge? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening sky was darkening when Ottavio Montserrat walked alone on the beach. At 55, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country, owning a massive yacht manufacturing company with factories in 3 countries. The sound of waves always calmed him, especially after difficult days like today. Another board meeting, another argument, he muttered to himself, kicking at the sand. His business partners wanted to sell the company to a foreign investor for billions. The offer was generous, almost too good to refuse, but Ottavio couldn't bear the thought of letting go of the company his father had built from nothing. As the cool breeze blew through his salt and pepper hair, Ottavio pulled his light jacket tighter around his shoulders. Despite his success, the mansion overlooking the ocean, the fleet of luxury cars, the private jet, there was an emptiness inside him that nothing seemed to fill. His wife Elena had died 5 years ago from cancer, and they never had children. His nephew Ricardo, his sister's son, was the closest thing to family he had. But Ricardo was more interested in partying with Ottavio's money than learning the business. Ottavio stopped to watch the waves crash against the shore. That's when he heard it, a soft sound, almost lost in the roar of the ocean. He looked around, confused. There was nobody else on this private stretch of beach. The sound came again, clearer this time. A baby's cry. Ottavio moved quickly toward the noise, his heart racing. Just a few yards away, partially hidden by a small dune, he saw something wrapped in a thin blanket. "My God," he whispered, dropping to his knees on the sand. There, wrapped in a damp blue blanket, was a baby, no more than a few months old, with rosy cheeks and dark hair plastered to its tiny head. The baby was cold but alive, small hands moving weakly. Who would do such a thing? Ottavio looked around frantically, but the beach was deserted. Then he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the blanket. With shaking hands, he took it and read the handwritten words. "If you found my son, please take care of him. I loved him more than anything, but I cannot give him the life he deserves. His true home is in the heart of whoever accepts him." Emotion crushed Ottavio's chest. The baby opened his eyes and stared at him with an innocent glow, as if they already knew each other. Without hesitation, Ottavio picked up the infant, cradling him against his chest to share his warmth. "Don't worry, little one, I've got you now." He hurried back toward his beach house, his mind racing. Should he call the police, child services, the hospital? The baby felt so fragile in his arms, so dependent. As he entered his luxurious beach, House Marta, his housekeeper for 20 years, gasped in shock. "Mr. Montserrat, who? I found him on the beach," Ottavio explained quickly. "Call Dr. Perez, tell him it's an emergency." "But sir, shouldn't we call the police?" Ottavio hesitated. "We will, but first, this baby needs medical attention." While waiting for the doctor, Marta heated some milk and found an old eyedropper in the medicine cabinet. They managed to feed the baby a few drops at a time. "He's hungry," Marta said, her motherly instincts taking over. "Poor little thing." Dr. Perez arrived within 30 minutes. After examining the baby boy, he looked up at Ottavio with relief. "He's healthy, just cold and hungry. I'd say he's about 3 months old, but Mr. Montserrat, we need to report this to the authorities." "I know," Ottavio said, unable to take his eyes off the baby. "But can we wait until morning? Just to make sure he's stable?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come back first thing tomorrow. In the meantime, he'll need formula, diapers. I'll take care of everything," Marta said firmly. "My daughter just had a baby. I'll call her to bring over supplies." After the doctor left, Ottavio sat in his armchair, holding the baby who had fallen asleep in his arms. Something stirred inside him, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, connection. "What should we call him?" Marta asked softly. "The note didn't mention a name," Ottavio said. He looked out the window at the dark ocean. "How about Miguel? It means, who is like God." And it was a miracle that I found. Him. Miguel, Marta repeated with a smile. It suits him. The next morning, Captain Cardoso of the local police arrived at Otavio's house. After hearing the story and examining the note, he shook his head. We'll investigate, of course, but honestly, Mr. Montserrat, cases like these rarely get solved. If the mother doesn't want to be found, what will happen to him? Otavio asked, watching Miguel sleep in a makeshift crib they had created from a basket. Child services will take him. He'll go into the system. Foster care, eventually adoption, if he's lucky. Otavio felt a sudden panic at the thought of the baby being taken away. What if I wanted to keep him? The captain raised his eyebrows. It's complicated. There are procedures, evaluations, waiting periods. You'd need to apply to become a foster parent first, then petition for adoption. I'll do whatever it takes. Later that day, Otavio's sister Beatriz arrived, her face tight with disapproval. Her son Ricardo trailed behind her, looking bored. Have you lost your mind? Beatriz demanded after Otavio explained the situation. You can't just take in some stranger's baby. What about diseases? What about the real parents coming back to claim him, or worse, to blackmail you? He was abandoned on a beach. He would have died if I hadn't found him. So call child services and let them handle it. You're 55, Otavio, a single man with a business empire to run. How are you going to raise a baby? I'll hire help, Otavio said firmly. I have the resources. Ricardo snorted. Uncle, is this a midlife crisis? Because usually men just buy sports cars. Beatriz paced the room. Think about what you're saying. This changes everything. The company succession, our family inheritance. Is that what you're worried about? Otavio asked quietly. The inheritance. Beatriz's face flushed. I'm worried about you making a rash decision. Ricardo is your heir. We've always planned. I've never formally named an heir, Otavio interrupted. And frankly, Ricardo hasn't shown much interest in the business. Ricardo shrugged. I told you I'd learn eventually. Otavio looked at them both, suddenly seeing clearly how they viewed him, as a means to wealth, not as family. His gaze drifted to Miguel, peacefully sleeping, completely dependent on the kindness of others. I've made my decision, he said firmly. I'm keeping him. Over the next few weeks, Otavio's life transformed. He hired Luciana, a young nurse, to help care for Miguel. He converted a guest room into a nursery, filling it with everything a baby could need. His lawyer, Paulo, started the complex legal process of fostering with intent to adopt. Word spread quickly through their coastal town. Some praised Otavio's kindness, others whispered about ulterior motives, or questioned his capability as a single father in his 50s. 1 month after finding Miguel, Otavio sat in a meeting with Laura Santos, a stern-faced social worker assigned to his case. Mr. Montserrat, while your financial resources are impressive, raising a child requires more than money, she said, reviewing his file. You work long hours, you travel frequently, you have no experience with children. I've reduced my hours at the office. My travel is on hold, and I'm learning every day, Otavio replied. I know it won't be easy, but I've never been more certain of anything. Laura's expression softened slightly. May I ask why this is so important to you? There are many children in need of homes. Why this particular baby? Otavio thought for a moment. Because Miguel found me when I was lost. As strange as it sounds, I believe we were meant to be together. Meanwhile, across town, in a small apartment, a young woman named Carolina Alves stared at a photograph of a baby. Her baby. Tears streamed down her face as she touched the image. I had no choice, she whispered to herself, but I need to know he's safe. Carolina worked as a cleaner at Otavio's corporate headquarters, though he had never noticed her. She knew who he was, everyone did. She had watched him for months before making her desperate decision, kind eyes, a generous reputation. He had lost his wife. He had everything to give a child, everything she couldn't. But now doubt and regret tortured her. Had she made a terrible mistake? What if he hadn't found the baby? What if Miguel was suffering? Carolina wiped her tears and made a decision. She would find a way to get close enough to see for herself that her son was safe, even if it broke her heart all over again. Back at Otavio's house, an unexpected visitor arrived. Clara Montserrat, Ottavio's mother, who had been traveling in Europe. "So it's true," the elegant 78-year-old woman said, looking down at Miguel in his crib. "My son found a baby on the beach. Mother, I can explain." Clara raised her hand to silence him. Then, to Ottavio's surprise, she gently picked up Miguel, who cooed and grabbed at her pearl necklace. "He has your eyes," she said with a small smile. "Mother, he's not biologically mine." "I know that," Clara interrupted. "But he looks at you the same way you used to look at your father, with complete trust." She cradled Miguel expertly. "Your father would have been proud of what you're doing." Tears welled in Ottavio's eyes. His mother's approval meant everything. "Beatrice called me in a panic," Clara continued. "Something about you losing your mind and threatening the family legacy." Ottavio sighed. "She's worried about her inheritance." Clara shook her head disapprovingly. "I raised her better than that." She looked down at Miguel again. "This child is a Montserrat now, as far as I'm concerned, and I expect you to raise him with our values." "I will," Ottavio promised. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ottavio sat in the nursery watching Miguel sleep. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell rhythmically. His little fingers curled into fists. "I don't know who your mother is," Ottavio whispered, "or why she left you, but I promise I will give you everything I have. Not just my name or my wealth, but my heart." Outside the nursery window, the ocean waves crashed against the shore, the same waves that had brought this unexpected gift into his life. Ottavio finally understood what had been missing all these years. Not success or recognition, but the simple, profound joy of loving someone more than himself. As Miguel stirred in his sleep, Ottavio gently placed his hand on the baby's chest, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath his palm. "Sleep well, my son," he whispered. "Tomorrow is a new day for both of us." Little did he know that forces were already in motion that would test his newfound happiness, and that the mystery of Miguel's origins was far from over. 3 months passed quickly. The temporary fostering arrangement was working well, and Ottavio had fallen into a comfortable routine with Miguel. The baby was thriving under the care of his new family, growing stronger each day, and even starting to babble his first sounds. Ottavio sat in his home office, reviewing documents for the upcoming board meeting while Miguel played on a colorful mat nearby. Luciana, the nurse, had stepped out to prepare the baby's lunch. "Look at you, so busy with your toys," Ottavio said with a smile as Miguel grabbed at a stuffed dolphin. "You're going to be a businessman like me someday, aren't you?" The doorbell rang, and moments later, Marta showed Ricardo into the office. "Uncle," Ricardo said, looking unusually serious in a well-tailored suit. "We need to talk." Ottavio raised an eyebrow. "This looks official. What's going on?" Ricardo glanced at Miguel on the floor. "Perhaps somewhere private." "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." "Miguel doesn't understand business talk yet," Ottavio said with a chuckle. Ricardo sat down, looking uncomfortable. "I've been thinking about what you said, about me not showing interest in the company. You were right." "Oh?" Ottavio was genuinely surprised. "I want to change that. I want to learn the business from the ground up." Ricardo straightened his tie. "I've even enrolled in business classes at the university." Ottavio studied his nephew's face, searching for sincerity. "What brought this on? Does it matter?" "I'm trying to be responsible, like you've always wanted." Before Ottavio could respond, his phone rang. It was Paulo, his lawyer. "Ottavio, I have news about the adoption process," Paulo said. "The investigation into Miguel's birth parents hasn't turned up anything. This is good news for your petition. When can we move forward?" "The next hearing is scheduled for next month. But there's something else. The social worker Laura Santos wants to conduct another home visit tomorrow. Apparently someone made a call expressing concerns." Ottavio's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of concerns?" "They wouldn't say. Just be prepared for tough questions." After hanging up, Ottavio noticed Ricardo watching him intently. "Problems with the kid?" Ricardo asked. "Nothing I can't handle," Ottavio replied firmly. The next day, Laura Santos arrived for her inspection. Her face was even more serious than usual as she sat across from Ottavio in the living room. "Mr. Montserrat, I received a call alleging that You're using this adoption to manipulate company shareholdings and family inheritance. The caller suggested you have no genuine interest in the child's welfare. Ottavio was stunned. That's absurd. Who would say such a thing? I can't reveal that information, but I need to take these allegations seriously. Ms. Santos, I love Miguel as if he were my own flesh and blood. Yes, I have a company. Yes, there will be an inheritance someday. But that has nothing to do with why I want to adopt him. Laura observed him carefully. The caller also mentioned that you've hired full-time staff to care for Miguel while you continue to work long hours. I hired Luciana because I want the best care for him, not to avoid my responsibilities. I've reduced my hours at the office. I'm here every morning and evening. As if on cue, Miguel began crying from the nursery. Ottavio immediately stood up. "Excuse me," he said, but Laura raised her hand. "If you don't mind, I'd like to observe." In the nursery, Ottavio picked up Miguel, checking his diaper and gently bouncing him. "What's wrong, buddy? Are you hungry?" The baby quieted almost immediately, resting his head on Ottavio's shoulder. The tenderness of the moment wasn't lost. On Laura, she made a note in her file. "You seem to know his cries," she commented. "This one means he just wants to be held," Ottavio explained. "The louder, more insistent cry is for hunger. The frustrated cry is when he can't reach a toy he wants." Laura nodded, impressed despite herself. "Mr. Montserrat, I've seen many people try to adopt for the wrong reasons, but I've rarely seen a bond form so quickly between a foster parent and child." After Laura left, Ottavio called his lawyer. "Someone is trying to sabotage the adoption. I need to know who." "I have my suspicions," Paolo replied carefully. "Beatrice," Ottavio said with certainty, "or Ricardo. It's possible, but without proof." That evening, Ottavio invited his sister for dinner. Beatrice arrived looking elegant as always, bringing an expensive baby gift that felt more like an obligation than a gesture of affection. "How nice to see you taking an interest in Miguel," Ottavio said pointedly as they sat down to eat. Beatrice sipped her wine. "He is my nephew now, isn't he? Or will be once the adoption is final." "If it becomes final," Ottavio replied. "Someone made allegations to the social worker, tried to paint me as an unfit parent who's only interested in using Miguel for business purposes." He watched her face carefully, but Beatrice didn't flinch. "How terrible," she said smoothly. "Who would do such a thing? That's what I'd like to know. Perhaps it was the birth mother," Beatrice suggested. "Maybe she's had second thoughts." The idea struck Ottavio like a physical blow. The possibility had never occurred to him. The note seemed pretty final, he said, but doubt had been planted. After Beatrice left, Ottavio sat on the terrace overlooking the ocean, lost in thought. What if Miguel's mother did want him back? Would he fight to keep the child he had come to love as his own? The very thought of losing Miguel made his heart ache. Across town, Carolina paced her small apartment, wringing her hands. She had started, working at Ottavio's beach house as part of the cleaning staff, taking over shifts whenever possible. She had glimpsed Miguel several times, seen how healthy and happy he looked, how Ottavio doted on him, but it wasn't enough. Every time she saw her baby in another person's arms, it felt like her heart was being torn from her chest. "I just need to know he's being loved," she whispered to herself. "That's all." But even as she said the words, Carolina knew they weren't entirely true. The separation was becoming unbearable. She pulled out a small photo of Miguel as a newborn, the only one she had, and traced his tiny face with her finger. The next day, Ottavio was surprised when Clara, his mother, arrived unannounced at his office. "Mother, is everything all right?" Clara set her purse down decisively. "I've been thinking about Miguel and your situation. I want to help." "Help how?" "Move back into the family home with you. Having a grandmother present will only strengthen your case for adoption." Ottavio was touched. "You'd do that?" "Family is everything, Ottavio, and that little boy is family now." As they discussed the details, Ottavio's assistant interrupted. "Sir, there's a Ms. Laura Santos here to see you. She says it's urgent." Laura entered, her face grim. "Mr. Montserrat, I've received information that may affect your adoption petition. A young woman has come forward claiming to be Miguel's birth mother. Otavio felt the blood drain from his face. What? Who is she? Her name is Carolina Alves. She works for your cleaning service. The name meant nothing to Otavio, but Clara gasped softly. Carolina, small pretty girl with dark hair, always very quiet. You know her mother? She's cleaned at my house several times, seemed like a sweet girl. Very respectful. Laura continued. She claims she left the baby where she knew you would find him. She specifically chose you. Why would she do that? And why come forward now? Otavio demanded. She says she had no other choice at the time. She was desperate, alone, with no resources to care for an infant, but now she's reconsidering. She wants visitation rights, at minimum. Otavio stood up, pacing the room. This could ruin everything. If she's the birth mother, and she didn't legally terminate her parental rights, it complicates things, Laura admitted. But it doesn't necessarily end your petition. The fact that she abandoned the child, even with the note, works against her. After Laura left, Clara put a comforting hand on her son's arm. What are you going to do? I need to meet her. This Carolina, I need to understand what she wants. The meeting was arranged for the following day at Paolo's office, neutral ground. Otavio arrived early, his stomach in knots. When Carolina entered, he was struck by how young she looked, barely in her 20s with the same dark hair as Miguel. She was visibly nervous, twisting her hands together. Ms. Alves, Otavio said formally, I understand you claim to be Miguel's birth mother. I don't claim anything, Mr. Montserrat. I am his mother. His name was Gabriel when he was born. The name hit Otavio like a punch. Gabriel. Miguel had a different name before. Why did you leave him on the beach? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Carolina's eyes filled with tears. I had nothing. No job, no family support. The baby's father disappeared when I told him I was pregnant. I was about to be evicted from my apartment. So you just abandoned your child? Carolina flinched at his tone. I researched you for weeks. I knew your walking routine, knew you were a good man who had lost his wife. I made sure you would find him quickly before the tide came in. I watched from behind the dunes until you picked him up. Otavio's anger faltered. He could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain he'd feel if someone took Miguel from him now. What do you want, Ms. Alves? I just want to be part of his life, she said softly. I'm not asking for custody. I know he has a good home with you, but he's still my son. I carried him for 9 months. I loved him enough to give him a better life than I could provide. Paolo, who had been silently observing, spoke up. Perhaps we could arrange a compromise, supervised visitation, gradually increasing if all goes well. Carolina nodded eagerly. That's all I'm asking for, a chance to know my son, for him to know me. Otavio felt torn. Part of him wanted to refuse, to protect the life he was building with Miguel. But another part understood the love that drove this young woman to such desperate measures. I need time to think, he said finally. Back at home, Otavio found Beatrice waiting for him. The news of Carolina's appearance had already reached her. This is a disaster, she declared. She'll take the baby back, and then where will you be? She's not asking for custody, only visitation. For now, Beatrice said ominously. But once she gets her foot in the door, who knows what she'll demand? Child support? A share of the Montserrat fortune? Not everyone is after money, Beatrice scoffed. Don't be naive. A poor girl abandons her baby at a billionaire's beach house, then conveniently shows up when he's settled in. This has gold digger written all over it. Otavio wasn't so sure. There had been genuine pain in Carolina's eyes, not calculation. That night, as he watched Miguel sleep, Otavio struggled with the decision. What was best for the child? Miguel had his whole life ahead of him. Didn't he deserve to know his birth mother? But what if Carolina wasn't satisfied with visitation? What if she fought for custody and won? The next day, Otavio made an unexpected decision. He asked to meet Carolina alone, away from lawyers and social workers. They met at a quiet cafe near the beach. Before I make any decision about visitation, he said, I want to understand something. Why did you really come forward now? After 3 months of silence, Carolina looked down at her coffee. I got a job at your beach house so I could see him. Just glimpses while I was cleaning, but it only made it harder. Every time I saw him, saw how you were with him. You could have approached me directly. And said what? Hello, I'm the woman who abandoned her baby on the beach. I was afraid you'd hate me, that you'd call the police. Otavio studied her face. Someone recently made allegations to the social worker handling Miguel's case, trying to paint me as an unfit parent. Carolina looked genuinely shocked. It wasn't me, I swear. I've seen how you are with him. You're a good father. The sincerity in her voice convinced him. If, and this is a big if, I agree to visitation, I need to know you won't try to take him away from me later. I won't, she promised. I know my limitations. I could never give him what you can. I just want to be part of his life, even in a small way. As they talked, Otavio began to see Carolina as a person, young, scared, but with a deep love for her child. She told him about her own childhood in a small coastal town, about her dreams of becoming a teacher someday, dreams put on hold when she became pregnant. By the time they parted, Otavio had made a decision. He would allow supervised visitation, but with conditions. Carolina would sign legal papers acknowledging his adoption of Miguel and waiving her parental rights, except for the visitation agreement. What Otavio didn't know was that Ricardo had seen him meeting with Carolina. With a scowl, Ricardo took photos of them talking, then made a phone call. Mother, Uncle Otavio is meeting with the birth mother right now. Looks very friendly. I think he's falling for her sob story. Beatrice's voice was cold with anger. Take pictures, we'll need evidence. Evidence for what? To show that he's not thinking clearly, that this woman is manipulating him. Beatrice paused. And Ricardo, find out everything you can about this Carolina. Everyone has secrets. We just need to find hers. As Otavio drove home, feeling surprisingly at peace with his decision, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The waves that had once brought Miguel into his life were now churning with an approaching storm, one that threatened everything he held dear. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching, plotting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 1 month later, Miguel celebrated his first birthday in the grand garden of the Montserrat mansion. Otavio had spared no expense. There was a small carousel, a petting zoo, and entertainers dressed as sea creatures, honoring the beach where Miguel had been found. Clara had moved back into the family home as promised, and was now proudly showing Miguel to the guests, the baby dressed in a sailor outfit that made him look even more adorable. He's getting so big, Marta said, smiling as she helped arrange a table filled with gifts. Yes, and into everything, Otavio laughed. Yesterday he crawled under my desk and found papers from 3 months ago. Otavio's eyes scanned the garden, looking for one particular guest. Carolina had been invited, her first official visit under their new arrangement. He had decided that a public event was the safest way to begin, with plenty of people around to keep things casual. Are you sure inviting her was wise? Clara asked quietly, noticing his searching gaze. She's part of his life now, Mother. Better to establish boundaries early. Carolina arrived carrying a small wrapped package. She looked different today. Her hair was neatly styled and she wore a simple but pretty blue dress instead of her usual cleaning uniform. She was visibly nervous as she approached. Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Montserrat, she said formally. Please call me Otavio, and you're welcome. This is an important day. Miguel, who was being held by Clara, turned his head at the sound of Carolina's voice. For a moment, there seemed to be a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Carolina's breath caught. May I hold him? She asked. Clara looked to Otavio, who nodded after a slight hesitation. As Miguel was transferred to Carolina's arms, the young woman's eyes filled with tears. Hello, my sweet boy, she whispered. Happy birthday. Miguel reached up and touched her face curiously. The moment was so tender that even Clara seemed moved. Across the garden, Beatrice watched with narrowed eyes, whispering urgently to Ricardo. Look at that. She's already acting like she's part of the family. Uncle seems to be encouraging it, Ricardo noted. We need to move faster, Beatrice insisted. Have you found anything on her background? Nothing substantial yet. No criminal record. but I have a private investigator digging deeper. The party continued, with Miguel being the center of attention. When it came time to cut the cake, Otavio found himself standing between Carolina and his family, a physical representation of the divided loyalties he now navigated. After most guests had left, Carolina approached Otavio privately. "I wanted to thank you again for allowing me to be here today." Otavio nodded. "Miguel seemed comfortable with you." "Babies sense things, adults don't," she said softly. Then, hesitantly, she added, "I've been thinking about our arrangement. The supervised visitation." Otavio tensed. "Is there a problem?" "No, not at all. I want to be more than a visitor in his life. I was wondering if you might consider letting me work here as Miguel's nanny." The request took Otavio completely by surprise. "His nanny? But you already have a job with the cleaning service." "I would quit, of course. I have experience with children. I used to babysit through high school." Carolina rushed on, seeing his skepticism. "I know it's asking a lot, but I could be near him every day and you could still oversee everything." "Carolina, I don't think that's a good idea. It would blur too many lines." Her face fell. "You still don't trust me." "It's not about trust. It's about what's best for Miguel. He needs stability, clear roles in his life. And I can't be his mother, is that it? Just a stranger who visits occasionally?" Before Otavio could respond, Beatrice approached, her timing impeccable as always. "Everything all right here?" she asked with false sweetness. Carolina quickly composed herself. "Yes, fine, I was just leaving." She turned to Otavio. "Thank you for today." After she left, Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "What was that about?" "Nothing." "Important," Otavio said, not wanting to share Carolina's request. "You know, brother, you've always been too trusting. That girl is playing you, working her way into Miguel's life, and yours. She's his birth mother, B. She has feelings for him. Feelings she didn't have when she abandoned him on a beach," Beatrice said sharply. "Don't let her manipulate you." The next day, Otavio sat in a meeting with the board of directors of Montserrat. Yachts. The company was facing a critical decision about expanding into new markets, and opinions were divided. "The European market is saturated," Alexander Costa, the CFO, was saying. "We should focus on emerging markets, Brazil, India, the UAE. But our brand is strongest in Europe," countered Marcos Vega, the marketing director. "Expansion should build on our existing reputation." Otavio was only half listening, his mind still on Carolina's request. He was surprised to see Ricardo enter the boardroom, dressed professionally and carrying a portfolio. "Sorry I'm late," Ricardo said, taking a seat at the table. Traffic was terrible. The board members exchanged glances. Otavio frowned. "Ricardo, this is a closed meeting. I invited him," Beatrice said smoothly. "As your heir and future leader of this company, he should be learning the business from the inside." "We haven't discussed his role in the company," Otavio said firmly. "Well, perhaps we should, considering recent developments. In your personal life," Beatrice replied pointedly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Everyone was aware of Otavio's adoption proceedings, and now the appearance of Miguel's birth mother had become gossip in their social circles. "This isn't the time or place, Bea." The meeting continued tensely, with Ricardo occasionally offering comments that showed he had indeed been studying the business. By the end, Otavio was both irritated and reluctantly impressed by his nephew's preparation. Everyone filed out. Ricardo lingered. "Uncle, could we talk?" Once they were alone, Ricardo's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "I want you to know that I'm serious about the company. I've been meeting with department heads, learning the operations." "I can see that, but you should have discussed this with me first." "Would you have agreed?" Ricardo asked bluntly. "Or are you planning to make Miguel your heir now?" The question caught Otavio off guard. "Miguel is a baby, Ricardo. He's not replacing you. But he will inherit, won't he? A portion that would have been mine? Is that what this is about?" "Money." Ricardo looked away. "Not just money. Position. Future. The things you always taught me to value." Otavio sighed. "Ricardo, there's enough for everyone, but leadership of this company needs to be earned, not inherited. Meanwhile, Carolina returned to her small apartment, disappointing heaviness in her chest. She had hoped Otavio would see her request as reasonable, as a way for Miguel to know her while still respecting Otavio's role as his father. Her phone rang, her supervisor at the cleaning service. "Carolina, there's been a complaint from the Montserrat Beach House. A complaint about my work, about items missing after your shift yesterday." Carolina's heart sank. "Missing items? That's impossible. I didn't take anything." "A gold watch and some cash, according to the report. I'm afraid we have to let you go pending investigation." After hanging up, Carolina sat in stunned silence. She knew exactly what had happened, or rather who was behind this. Beatrice Montserrat had made her dislike obvious at the birthday party. This was her way of retaliating, of pushing Carolina out of Miguel's life. But she wouldn't give up so easily. Not when it came to her son. The next day, while Otavio was at work, Carolina went to his beach house determined to clear her name. She was surprised when Clara answered the door, Miguel on her hip. "Mrs. Montserrat," Carolina said nervously, "I need to speak with your son about an accusation that's been made against me." Clara studied the young woman for a moment. "He's not here, but perhaps I can help. Come in." In the elegant living room, Clara set Miguel down with some toys before turning to Carolina. "Now, what's this about an accusation? Someone claimed I stole things during my cleaning shift." "It's not true, Mrs. Montserrat. I would never—" "I believe you," Clara said simply. Carolina blinked in surprise. "You do? I've been around long enough to recognize a setup when I see one." Clara's eyes were sharp and knowing. "My daughter can be high, protective of family interests." "Then you know she's behind this?" "Let's just say I have my suspicions." Clara watched as Miguel crawled toward Carolina, reaching for her. "He seems to like you." Carolina smiled, picking him up gently. "I sing to him sometimes when I'm cleaning and he's nearby. Little songs my grandmother taught me." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Otavio told me about your request to become Miguel's nanny. He was right to refuse." Carolina's face fell. "Not because you don't deserve to be near your son," Clara continued, "but because it would put both you and Otavio in an impossible situation. The boundaries would become too blurred. I just want to be part of his life. And you will be. But rushing things will only create more resistance." Clara paused, "especially from Beatrice and Ricardo. Why do they hate me so much? They don't even know me." "It's not personal, dear. It's about control, money, power. The things people fight over when they have too much of everything else." Clara sighed. "The Montserrat fortune is substantial, and now there's a new potential heir." Later that evening, when Otavio returned home, Clara told him about Carolina's visit and the false accusation. "That sounds like Beatrice is doing," he said, angry but not surprised. "Almost certainly, Clara." "Agreed. You need to put a stop to it, Otavio. This vendetta against the girl isn't right." "I'll talk to B," he promised, "and I'll call Carolina's supervisor, clear this up." The following day, Otavio invited Carolina to meet him at a cafe near her apartment. She arrived looking tired and worried. "I spoke to your supervisor," he said. "Explained there was a misunderstanding. Your job is safe if you want it." "Thank you," she said sincerely, "but I'm not sure I can go back there, knowing what your sister thinks of me. I'm sorry about Beatrice. She's protective, sometimes to a fault." "She thinks I'm after your money," Carolina said bluntly. Otavio didn't deny it. "Are you?" Carolina looked him straight in the eyes. "If I wanted money, Mr. Montserrat, I could have asked for it from the beginning. I could have kept Miguel and demanded child support. I could have gone to the press with my story, but I didn't. I only want what's best for my son." Her directness impressed him. "I believe you, Carolina, and I've been thinking about your situation, your job, your education. What about them? You mentioned once that you wanted to be a teacher. Why did you stop studying?" "Money, of course. When I got pregnant, I had to work full-time. There was no time or resources for school." Otavio nodded. "What if I could help with that, a scholarship through my foundation? You could finish your education, become a teacher." Carolina was stunned. "You would do that? Why?" because Miguel deserves a birth mother he can be proud of, and because it's the right thing to do. For the first time, Carolina saw Otavio not just as the wealthy man who had taken in her son, but as someone with genuine compassion. It changed something between them, created a foundation of respect where before there had only been caution and formality. What neither of them noticed was Ricardo seated at the back of the cafe, taking photos of their meeting with his phone. That night, Ricardo showed the photos to his mother. "Look how cozy they are. Coffee dates now? What's next?" Beatrice studied the images with narrowed eyes. "He's falling for her sob stories." "It's worse than that, Mother. I think he's falling for her." The idea seemed to genuinely alarm Beatrice. That cannot happen. A cleaning girl? The family would never recover from such a scandal. "What should we do?" Beatrice thought for a moment. "It's time to use what we know. Your investigator friend found something useful, yes?" Ricardo hesitated. "It's not much. Just a name." "The father of her child?" "Possibly. A man she was seeing around the time she would have gotten pregnant. Diego Ferreira, small-time criminal with drug connections. Currently in prison for possession. With intent to distribute." Beatrice smiled coldly. "Perfect. Dig deeper. I want everything on this Diego, and Carolina's connection to him." Back at the Montserrat mansion, Otavio sat with Paulo, his lawyer, discussing the final steps of Miguel's adoption. "The hearing is scheduled for next week," Paulo said. "With Carolina's signed agreement to the visitation arrangement and her formal consent to the adoption, it should be straightforward. And if someone contests it, Beatrice, for instance, on what grounds? She has no standing in this case." Otavio sighed. "She always finds a way, Paulo. She's determined to protect Ricardo's inheritance. Which is why we should update your will," Paulo advised. "Make your intentions clear regarding both Miguel and Ricardo." After Paulo left, Otavio went to check on Miguel, who was already asleep in his crib. Clara sat in a rocking chair nearby, a book in her lap. "You don't have to watch him all night, Mother," Otavio said softly. "I know, but I like to. It reminds me of when you were small." Clara set her book aside. "You're doing the right thing, you know, with the girl, helping her, with her education." "How did you know about that?" she called to thank me. "Seems she thinks I had something to do with your decision." Otavio smiled. "You did, in a way. You always taught me to look for the good in people." Clara's expression grew serious. "Be careful, Otavio. Not about Carolina. I believe she's sincere. But Beatrice won't stop. She sees Carolina as a threat to everything she's planned. What can she possibly do? The adoption is almost finalized. Don't underestimate your sister, or how far she'll go to protect what she believes is hers." Clara's warning proved prophetic. The very next day, as Otavio was leaving his office, he was approached by a reporter from a popular gossip magazine. "Mr. Montserrat, is it true that you're adopting a child whose father is a convicted drug dealer, and that the mother abandoned the baby to hide the father's identity?" Otavio stopped cold. "What are you talking about?" The reporter thrust a recorder toward him. "We have information that Miguel's biological father is Diego Ferreira, currently serving time for drug trafficking. Did you know about his criminal connections when you took in the child?" Otavio pushed past without answering, his mind racing. Who had fed this information to the press? And more importantly, was it true? He called Carolina immediately. When she answered, he could tell she was crying. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I just heard. Is it true? Is Diego Ferreira Miguel's father?" There was a long silence before Carolina answered. "I don't know. We were together. But there was someone else too, I was never sure." The admission hit Otavio hard, not because he cared about Diego's identity, but because Carolina had kept this from him. "You should have told me everything from the beginning." "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't take Miguel if you knew there was a chance his father was someone like Diego. And now it's in the press. The timing of the adoption hearing couldn't be worse." "I'm so sorry," Carolina whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." As Otavio hung up, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger at the public exposure, concern for how it might affect Miguel's future, and an unexpected protectiveness toward Carolina, who was surely suffering under this scrutiny. What he didn't know was that the storm was just beginning. Beatriz had set events in motion that would test not only his commitment to Miguel, but everything he believed about family, loyalty, and love. And somewhere in a prison visiting room, a man named Diego Ferreira was reading a newspaper article about a wealthy businessman adopting a baby that might be his son. A slow smile spread across his face as he realized the opportunity this presented. Once released, he would have a claim to make, one that could be very profitable indeed. The scandal broke across all the major newspapers the next morning. "Billionaire's adopted baby, son of drug dealer?" screamed the headlines. Reporters camped outside the Montserrat mansion, their cameras flashing whenever anyone entered or left. Inside, Otavio paced the living room while Paulo made urgent phone calls to try to control the damage. "This is a nightmare," Otavio muttered. "The judge will see these headlines right before our hearing." Clara sat calmly in her chair, watching her son with concern. "The truth will prevail, Otavio. You've done nothing wrong. But the timing couldn't be worse, and I can't help wondering who leaked this information to the press." As if on cue, Beatriz swept into the room, perfectly dressed and seemingly undisturbed by the chaos outside. "Those vultures," she said, gesturing toward the windows. "They have no respect for privacy." Otavio studied his sister's face. "It's strange how they suddenly discovered all this information about Miguel's possible father, don't you think? Right before the adoption hearing." Beatriz met his gaze without flinching. "Perhaps your girlfriend should have been more forthcoming about her past. She's not my girlfriend, B, and you know exactly what happened here. Are you accusing me of something? Did you really think this would stop the adoption? That I would abandon Miguel because of who his biological father might be?" Beatriz's composure slipped slightly. "I was trying to protect you. To protect our family name. Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation, to the business? Montserrat Hare, son of drug lord. Our stock will plummet." "I don't care about the stock," Otavio shouted, his patience finally snapping. "I care about Miguel, about giving him a good life. And what about Ricardo? What about the promises you made to him?" "I never promised Ricardo would inherit everything. That was your assumption." Clara stood up, her quiet authority immediately drawing their attention. "Enough. This fighting solves nothing. What's done is done, and now we must deal with the consequences." Paulo hung up his phone and joined them. "I've arranged for a statement to be released, emphasizing that Miguel's parentage has no bearing on Otavio's petition for adoption, and that his only concern is the welfare of the child." "And Carolina?" Otavio asked. "How is she handling this?" "She's devastated," Paulo replied. "Reporters are stalking her apartment building. She can barely leave for work." "Bring her here," Otavio decided suddenly. "Here?" Beatriz repeated incredulously. "Have you lost your mind?" "She and Miguel are both victims in this. I won't leave her to face this alone." Beatriz threw up her hands. "This is exactly what she wanted, to worm her way into your home, your life." "That's enough, Beatriz," Clara said firmly. "Your brother has made his decision." Later that day, Carolina arrived with a small suitcase, looking exhausted and frightened. Miguel, who was playing in the living room, immediately crawled toward her when she entered. "I'm so sorry for bringing this trouble to your family," she said, picking up her son. "You didn't," Otavio replied, giving Beatriz a pointed look. "This was deliberately orchestrated by someone who cares more about money than Miguel's well-being." Beatriz lifted her chin defiantly before stalking out of the room. The days that followed were tense. Carolina stayed in a guest room, spending time with Miguel but keeping a respectful distance from Otavio. She was acutely aware of her position, neither family nor employee, but something in between. One evening, as she watched Miguel playing with blocks on the floor, Otavio joined her. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Your mother has been kind to me. She's a good judge of character." Carolina hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Will this scandal affect the adoption?" "Paulo doesn't think so. The judge will focus on Miguel's best interests, not tabloid headlines. And what about Carolina? Couldn't finish the sentence, Diego Ferreira, Otavio supplied. Has he contacted you? No. We haven't spoken since before Miguel was born. He didn't want anything to do with me once I told him I was pregnant. But now that he knows there's money involved, that might change. Carolina nodded miserably. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about him from the beginning. We all have parts of our past we'd rather forget, Otavio said gently. What matters is who we choose to be now. The moment was interrupted by Ricardo, who entered without knocking. He stopped short when he saw them sitting together. Uncle, we need to talk privately. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of Carolina, Otavio replied calmly. Ricardo's jaw tightened. Fine, I came to apologize. This was the last thing Otavio expected. Apologize for what? For going along with Mother's plan to leak information about Diego Ferreira to the press. I didn't think it through. I didn't realize how it would affect the company. The company? Otavio repeated. That's what you're concerned about? Our stock has dropped 15% since the scandal broke. Major clients are threatening to cancel orders. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. And Miguel, Carolina, any concern for how this has affected them? Ricardo had the grace to look ashamed. I didn't think it would go this far. That's the problem, Ricardo. You never think about consequences, only about what you want. After Ricardo left, Carolina turned to Otavio. Your company is suffering because of me. Because of my past. No, because of my sister's vindictiveness, and we'll weather this storm. The day of the adoption hearing arrived. Otavio, Carolina, Paulo, and Laura Santos all testified before the judge. Beatriz and Ricardo sat in the back of the courtroom, their presence a silent pressure. When it was Carolina's turn to speak, she stood tall despite her nervousness. I gave my son up because I wanted him to have a better life than I could provide. When I chose Mr. Montserrat to find him, I didn't know what kind of father he would be, but now I've seen him with Miguel, seen the love between them, and I know I made the right choice. I support this adoption completely. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, asked pointed questions about Diego Ferreira. Has the biological father been notified of these proceedings? Paulo stepped forward. Your Honor, there is no conclusive evidence that Diego Ferreira is the biological father. He has never claimed paternity, never supported the child, and never sought contact with Miss Alves after learning of her pregnancy. Nevertheless, the judge replied, if there is a possibility that he is the father, he has rights that must be considered. Otavio felt his heart sink. This was exactly what he had feared. The judge continued, I will grant a conditional approval of the adoption, pending a 30-day period, during which notice will be published regarding these proceedings. If the potential biological father comes forward during this time, we will need to revisit the petition. It wasn't the clear victory they had hoped for, but it wasn't a defeat either. As they left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed. Keep walking, Paulo advised. No comments today. Back at the mansion, Otavio tried to focus on the positive. 30 days isn't so long. And what are the chances Diego will even see the notice? Hi, Carolina said quietly. With all this media attention, someone will make sure he knows. Then we'll deal with it. Together. The word hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either expected. As predicted, it took less than a week for Diego Ferreira to make contact. His lawyer called Paulo, making it clear that Diego was very interested in his parental rights, particularly how they might be translated into financial terms. He wants money, Paulo explained to Otavio. Not custody, not visitation, just cash. How much? Otavio asked grimly. 5 million to start, plus ongoing support. It's blackmail. Essentially, yes, but cleverly disguised as a father's concern for his child's future. Otavio was furious. He abandoned Carolina when she was pregnant. He has no right to profit from Miguel now. Legally, if he is the biological father, he has rights. Rights he can waive for a price. Can we prove he's not the father? A paternity test would settle it. But if it shows he is the father, Otavio faced an impossible choice. pay what amounted to ransom, or risk losing Miguel if Diego proved to be his biological father and decided to fight for custody out of spite. When he explained the situation to Carolina, she broke down in tears. "This is all my fault. My terrible choices coming back to haunt not just me, but Miguel too. We'll find a solution," Otavio promised, though he wasn't sure how. Unexpectedly, it was Clara who suggested a path forward. Why not meet with him? Not to pay him off, but to understand what he really wants. He wants money, Mother, that's clear enough. Perhaps. But men like that are often driven by more than just greed, ego, revenge, power. If you understand his true motivation, you may find leverage. Following Clara's advice, Otavio arranged to meet Diego Ferreira, who had been temporarily released for a parole hearing. They met in Paulo's office with lawyers present. Diego was not what Otavio expected. He was handsome in a rough way, well-spoken, and carried himself with confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Mr. Montserrat," he said with a smirk. "Finally, we meet, the man raising my son." "We don't know that Miguel is your son," Otavio replied coolly. Diego shrugged. "Carolina seemed pretty sure at the time, but I guess we can settle that with a test, right? What do you really want, Mr. Ferreira? Because if it's to be part of Miguel's life, I doubt your criminal record will impress the family court." Diego's smirk faded. "Let's cut the crap. You're rich, I'm not. The way I see it, that boy is my winning lottery ticket. The question is, how much is he worth to you?" The crude assessment of Miguel as a commodity made Otavio's blood boil. "He's not a ticket or a bargaining chip, he's a child. A child who deserves financial security," Diego countered smoothly. "I'm his father. I have rights. Rights you showed no interest in until you saw headline news about a billionaire adopting your possible son." Diego leaned back in his chair. "Judge won't care about my motivations. Law's the law." As they talked, Otavio observed Diego carefully. Remembering his mother's advice about finding leverage, he noticed how Diego's eyes flickered whenever Otavio mentioned media attention or public image. The man clearly enjoyed the notoriety. This situation had brought him in prison. "What if," Otavio said carefully, "instead of a one-time payment, we discussed a different arrangement, something that could benefit you more in the long term?" Diego looked interested. "I'm listening." "My foundation works with ex-offenders, helps them build legitimate businesses. With your parole hearing coming up, you could be part of that program. Employment, housing, a fresh start, and money. A reasonable settlement for waiving parental rights, yes, but not millions. And contingent on you staying out of trouble, away from drugs." Diego laughed. "You think you can reform me, rich man? I think you're smarter than you pretend to be. And I think prison is getting old." For the first time, Diego's facade cracked slightly. "How do I know you'll keep your word after I sign away my rights? Because unlike you, my word means something. And because the foundation's work is public, if I went back on our agreement, you could take that to the press too." After Diego left to consider the offer, Paulo looked at Otavio with admiration. "That was brilliantly handled. You found his pressure point." "It's not about winning," Otavio replied. "It's about finding a solution where everyone can move forward." The next day, unexpected support came from Beatrice, who arrived at the mansion, looking unusually subdued. "I heard about your meeting with Ferreira," she said. "Ricardo told me." "And you're here to tell me I'm making another mistake?" Beatrice shook her head. "I'm here to help if I can. The foundation approach was clever, but men like Diego Ferreira need more incentive to disappear permanently." "What are you suggesting?" "Let me handle the settlement negotiations. I can be very persuasive." Otavio studied his sister skeptically. Why the sudden change of heart? "The board meeting yesterday was brutal. Our major investors are threatening to pull out if this scandal continues. I was wrong to think exposing Miguel's parentage would solve anything. It's made everything worse." "So this is still about the company, not Miguel. Does it matter why I want to help as long as the result is the same? Ferreira gone, the adoption secured, our family name protected." As much as Otavio distrusted his sister's motivations, he recognized that her negotiating skills were formidable. Together with Paulo, they crafted an agreement that Diego found acceptable. A moderate settlement, employment through a subsidiary company after his release, and an apartment in a different city, far from Miguel and the Montserrat family. The key condition was a legally binding confidentiality agreement, preventing Diego from ever speaking publicly about Miguel or the Montserrats again. "He'll take it," Beatrice said confidently, after reviewing the final offer. "It's more than he expected, after your initial meeting, and it gives him a way to save face." She was right. 2 days later, Diego signed away all parental rights and claims to Miguel, underwent a paternity test that confirmed he was indeed the biological father, and accepted the settlement terms. The 30-day waiting period passed, without further incident, and the adoption was finalized in a private court proceeding. Miguel was legally Otavio's son, with Carolina granted generous visitation rights as part of the arrangement. On the day the adoption became official, Otavio hosted a small celebration at the beach house. Only family and close friends were invited. No press, no business associates, just the people who truly cared about Miguel. As the sun began to set, Otavio found Carolina standing alone on the balcony, looking out at the ocean. "This is where it all began," she said softly. "I left him right down there on that stretch of sand. The best mistake I ever found," Otavio replied, joining her at the railing. Carolina smiled. "He looks happy. You've given him everything I hoped for." "Not everything. He needs you too, Carolina. Your love, your history, your spirit." "I start classes next week," she said, changing the subject slightly. "Teacher training. It feels like a dream. You'll be excellent at it." Children naturally trust you. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the waves. So much had changed in the year since Miguel had come into their lives. Otavio had discovered a capacity for love he never knew he possessed. Carolina had found strength she didn't know she had. Even Beatrice, though still difficult, had shown glimpses of a better nature when truly pressed. "What happens now?" Carolina asked. "With us, I mean. We're connected forever through Miguel, but we're still figuring out what that means," Otavio finished for her. "One day at a time, I think. No pressure, no expectations." Inside the house, Clara watched them from the window, a knowing smile on her face. Beside her, Miguel played happily, occasionally glancing up as if to make sure his 2 favorite people were still there. "Your father and mother are finally talking," Clara told the little boy. "About time, don't you think?" Miguel babbled in response, a stream of almost words that made Clara laugh. Ricardo approached, looking uncomfortable, but determined. "Grandmother, I've been meaning to speak with you about my behavior lately." "You mean you're plotting with your mother to sabotage Miguel's adoption?" Ricardo winced. "Yes, that. I was wrong. I see that now." "It's not me you need to apologize to," Clara said, firmly. "I know I already spoke to Uncle Otavio, and I want to apologize to Carolina too. I judged her unfairly." Clara's expression softened. "That shows maturity, Ricardo. Your uncle doesn't expect you to be perfect. He just wants you to be honest, to care about something beyond yourself." "I do care about the company. I've been working hard, learning everything I can. That's a start. But a business is more than balance sheets and profit margins. It's about people, relationships, trust. Your uncle built his success on those foundations." Outside, the conversation between Otavio and Carolina had taken a more personal turn. "I never thanked you," Otavio said, "for choosing me to find Miguel, for trusting me with something so precious." "I watched you for weeks before I made my decision," Carolina admitted. "You would walk on this beach every evening, sometimes smiling at the sunset, sometimes looking so sad I could tell you were a good man with an empty space in your heart." "Not empty anymore," Otavio said softly. Their eyes met and something shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, but possibility. The potential for a different kind of family than either had imagined. Inside, Miguel had grown tired of his toys. He pulled himself up on the furniture and took a few wobbly steps toward the balcony door, his first independent steps without holding on to anything. Clara gasped. "Ricardo, look, he's walking!" Hearing the excitement, Otavio and Carolina turned to see Miguel teetering toward them, arms outstretched, a determined expression on his face. "Oh my God," Carolina whispered, kneeling down. "Come on, buddy." "Otavio, encouraged, kneeling beside her. "You can do it." With everyone watching in breathless anticipation, Miguel took one step, then another, crossing the threshold from the living room to the balcony, from one chapter of his life to the next. When he reached them, both Otavio and Carolina enveloped him in a hug, their joy and pride mingling with tears. In that moment, they were simply a family, not defined by blood or legal documents, but by the love that had brought them together against all odds. As night fell, the stars came out over the ocean, the same ocean that had once carried a desperate mother's hope in the form of a baby wrapped in a thin blanket, the same waves that had guided a lonely man to find his greatest treasure. Miguel fell asleep that night in his room at the beach house, the sound of waves in the background, a constant reminder of where his journey began. On his dresser sat a small glass bottle containing sand from the spot where Otavio had found him, a gift from Carolina to commemorate his adoption. Beside him, two people who had once been strangers now sat united by their love for this child, watching over him as he dreamed, ready to guide him through whatever adventures awaited. The baby of the waves had found his true home at last, not in wealth or privilege, but in the hearts of those who had chosen to love him against all odds, above all else. And as for Otavio and Carolina, their story was just beginning. Two souls from different worlds connected by fate, and a tiny hand that had somehow managed to hold both their hearts at once. The waves continued their eternal rhythm outside, a reminder that life, like the ocean, is full of surprises. Some that wash away what we thought we knew, and others that bring unexpected treasures to our shore, if only we have the courage to reach out and claim them.